Hello and welcome to a new episode of David's Divergent Discussions. Today I'm really excited to have Nick Walker on the podcast. Um, Nick Walker is the author of Neuroqueer Heresies and co-author of the Weird Luck webcomic series. And most importantly, Nick Walker is one of the people who created Neuroqueer Theory and conceptualized it. And as you may know, if you followed my writing, Neuroqueer Theory is somewhat of a hyper focus for me at the moment, and in general, more or less since I read Neuroqueer Heresies, it's really been a life-changing theory for me. It's changed my entire outlook on not just neurodiversity, but for me, what it means to be a human being. And yeah, I'm just really excited to have you here. So I thought we'd start today's discussion with a little bit of what neuroqueer theory means to us. So Nick, what is neuroqueer theory to you?
Oh, what a great question to start with. Well, it is most simply put, it's an expansion of queer theory into the realm of neurodiversity. And so I started with this queer theory idea, particularly Judith Butler's work about the constructed and performative nature of gender, and extended that idea into my thinking on neurodiversity. So we have this idea in neuroqueer theory that neuronormativity and cis heteronormativity are entwined with each other, that there's this pervasive, societally imposed, socially constructed normativity, and cis heteronormativity and neuronormativity are just different facets of the same thing, and they're really inseparable from each other. And so, like heteronormativity, neuronormativity can be queered, can be creatively subverted and fucked with and diverged from and customized and what have you. And also, because the different normativities are entwined, to queer one ultimately is to also be queering the other. So that, I would say, is the heart of neuroqueer theory.
Yeah, I really like this idea of subverting normative ideas, because for me it's expanded these boundaries I had, in that it started with, queering my concept of who I am as a man and who I am as an autistic person. And it got to this point where all of a sudden it was like everything that we hold to be true, suddenly I was seeing it as everything is socially constructed. Everything we understand about what it is to our sense of identity, it's entirely built on these ideas that we as a society have created. And all of a sudden it was like, what's objectively true? Like, or is it just that we have to go by our own subjective truths, and where those subjective truths overlap, that creates some semblance of objectivity? And for me, neuroqueer theory has taught me, well, essentially, it taught me what I already knew, but it's given me language for it, that there's no such thing as normal. Like, we are, humanity is this diverse and interlinked, interconnected tapestry of difference. And for me, it was about, neuroqueer theory has shown me how I can break free of what society says I should be, so that in a world where you can be anything, I can be me.
Yes, beautiful.
So when considering the sort of the basics, the interplay between cis heteronormativity and neuronormativity, I'm interested to hear more of your thoughts on the interplay between gender, sexuality, and neurodiversity. Where do you think these things overlap?
Well, in many different ways, because I think they're intertwined, because we're just talking about the embodied selfhood of a person, the embodied self-expression and internal experience of a person. And so gender is an aspect of that, sexuality is an aspect of that. And when I say sexuality, I include asexuality because that is an orientation towards sexuality. So our sexuality and gender are entwined with one another, and then our general mode of neurocognitive functioning, our neurocognitive styles and capacities are entwined with that. They affect and are affected by our performance of gender and how we've internalized gender. I mean, what is sexuality and what are the boundaries of it exactly? That itself is socially constructed. What are the boundaries of these things? What is or isn't sexual? That varies culturally and individually considerably. What is or isn't gender? What is or isn't gendered in our society, and what is or isn't a gender expression in some way? I mean, the pervasiveness of cis heteronormativity is such that there's a gendered way to do everything, and so our every act really becomes an expression of gender, either normative gender or some queering of normative gender. And what is or isn't neuronormativity or divergence from neuronormativity, queering of neuronormativity? I mean, the societal, the socially constructed sense of normal is all pervasive in terms of governing. Everyone is carrying a sense, a socially constructed and internalized sense of normal, even though different people's senses of normal have been shaped very differently by their cultural experience. And in a sense, everything is either, conforming to that or queering it in some way, diverging it in some way. So, everything about our cognitive style, our sensory style, our way of thinking and feeling, all of that is tied in with our gender expression, because every aspect of our embodied selfhood is tied in with our gender expression in a society that genders everything so much. So, and of course, our gender expression and gender experience shapes our cognitive style very much. And to alter one's gender performance and one's gender experience, what is building new neural pathways? What is altering one's cognitive style? What is altering one's relational style? And in altering one's relational style, I mean, our cognition, our cognitive experience, emotional experience, the whole psyche is relational and is constantly being shaped and reshaped relationally. We exist always as relational beings in relation with others. And when we alter our gender and sexuality, when we explore it and queer it and play with it in various ways, we're altering who we are relationally to society and to others. And by doing that, we're altering our psyche and the way that our psyche gets shaped relationally.
Yeah, and it sort of brings me into a point that I wanted to make is you don't have to be neurodivergent to engage in neuroqueering.
Yes.
A person who relates to being neurotypical can neuroqueer. They can queer their expression of themselves. They can queer their neurology. I know in your
Yes.
book you talk about neuroqueering through the use of psychedelic drugs. You talk about neuroqueering through meditative practice. The thing about neuroqueer theory is there's no boundaries per se on how one queers their neuroqueers. There's no boundaries on how one embodies themselves. So anyone can access neuroqueer theory. But I've always wondered, if a neurotypical person engages in neuroqueering enough, do they become neurodivergent?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Neurotypicality, because there's no such thing as a neurotypical brain. Neurotypicality really just means conformity to local dominant standards of neuronormativity. And so in querying that and querying one's performance of selfhood so that one diverges from neuronormativity, one is becoming neurodivergent. One is diverging from neurotypicality, ceasing to be neurotypical. And that, I think, is the most radical point of neuroqueer theory, the most radical piece of it that I think when I called my book Neuroqueer Heresies, the early parts of the book, my early writing about the neurodiversity paradigm and autistic empowerment, that's heretical from kind of a mainstream point of view, from the point of view of what I call the pathology paradigm, where ways of being autistic is pathologized. That sort of mainstream view that the whole autistic rights movement and neurodiversity movement has been pushing back against. It's heretical from that point of view. It's heretical from the point of view of behaviorists and people who think autism is a pathology that needs to be medically cured or something. But the real heresies for me were in the final portions of the book, where I laid out the premises of neuroqueer theory, because neuroqueer theory is heretical not just by the standards of the old dying mainstream paradigms, but it's also heretical by the standards of the neurodiversity movement and progressive politics in general, because it's a rejection of identity politics. It's a rejection of the whole idea of fixed essentialist identities. And of course, so-called progressive politics these days are completely suffused with identity politics. They're so deeply rooted in identity politics, and to the same extent that right-wing politics are deeply rooted in identity politics. Like the entire political discourse across the spectrum, and just social discourse in general, discourse around social justice, all of that, and just the way people conceptualize themselves so often these days is so rooted in identity politics and in just the concept of identity and what identity categories do you fit into. And neuroqueer theory, queer theory has always rejected that when it comes to gender and sexuality. Rejected the whole, you're either born this way or born this way idea. And neuroqueer theory extends that further. It really is a rejection of identity politics, and particularly around gender and around neurodiversity. So it rejects the entire idea that there's such a thing as a neurotypical brain, that the whole idea that a person could be born neurotypical. Neurotypicality, like a heteronormative gender role, is a socially learned performance, and anyone can drop that performance anytime. So the whole us and them of neurotypical versus neurodivergent is an illusion. because anyone can, in fact, diverge from neurotypicality at any time. I still think the term neurotypical is useful in the same way that the term straight is useful or the term cisgender is useful. But nobody is doomed to being straight. Anyone can start experimenting sexually. Nobody is doomed to be cisgender. Anyone can start playing around with their gender performance and transitioning at any time. Same thing. No one is born neurotypical and no one is doomed to be neurotypical. Anyone can choose to diverge from it through the practice of neuroqueering at any time.
Yeah, and I like this sort of heretical idea that identity is a moving target, because for me, obviously in my most recent chat book, I sort of introduced my own concept of the chaotic self, which I kind of chose the name intentionally because my sense of self is chaos. Like, who I am now is not who I was 10 years ago. It's not who I will be 10 years from now. Every aspect of my identity can change, not just on a yearly basis or a monthly basis. It could change from moment to moment. As I learn new things, as I have new experiences, my entire sense of self changes. And it kind of, for me, neuroqueer theory raises these questions about the sort of philosophies of the self and, you know, how do we know who we are? Because at any given moment, who we are is different to who we were at another given moment. There is no fixed identity. You know, I identify as autistic, schizophrenic, cisgendered, and queer, but all of those aspects of my identity that make up the whole, I could wake up tomorrow and start doing things that alter that sense of identity. I could have experiences that change how I relate to myself. And so for me, neuroqueer theory is that radical acceptance that the only thing that I can know for sure is who I am in this very moment, because this moment will pass, and the things that go on throughout life and the actions I choose, the way I embody myself could change that sense of identity. So I guess for me, I wonder how that's how I rationalize my sense of self, is through this idea of the chaotic self and that I've written about. I was wondering how you rationalize your sense of self with regards to neuroqueer theory, because everyone's way of rationalizing their sense of self is going to be different.
Yeah, mine is not so different from what you just described, and is very, I mean, neuroqueer theory itself and my sense of self has been very informed by my spiritual transformative practices, by decades of practicing Aikido, of practicing Zen especially, and practicing, you know, these transformative physical theater techniques. Really, yes, myself feels extremely fluid and does change continually, and I'm actively, it changes continually through how I live and through experience, and it changes continually through active intentional practice and decisions to change and experiment on my part. So it is continually changing, and ultimately what's behind it is not exactly, you know, not any sort of identity category. There's the self is a locus of experience, and it's constantly fluid. It's something very protean, something very unformed and formless underneath at whatever's being embodied at the time. And I've worked, and I'm still working to get closer to that, to maintain a sense of that. And that's part for me of the Buddhist practice of letting go of attachments, which is a very difficult lifelong practice. And I'm not particularly good at it, but I do find that, there's that mundane interpretation of non-attachment, of not being attached to, material wealth or something like that. But there's also this non-attachment to external expressions of the self, to particular identities. And so, yeah, it's all, everything becomes much more fluid as one taps into what's underneath it all. And I think that what's worrisome to me in terms of the dominance of identity politics in our social discourse these days is how stuck people are, how convinced people are, I am this and this and this, and you are this and this and this, and they are this and this and this, and therefore, this group, these groups are the enemy, and that's unchanging, and everyone is in these, put themselves in these stuck fixed positions that they don't regard as voluntary. They don't regard themselves as having a choice of being in these positions. They regard their identity as absolutely fixed and essential to who they are. And then they feel the same way about other people's identities, and they impose categories on others and ally with them or hate them based on that. And so that attachment and the projections it involves causes so much strife and division among people. It's such an obstacle to human thriving and human growth, and it turns social discourse and politics constantly into a zero-sum game. So I'm really hoping to free myself from that more and more, and to be a part of changing that in some way. That will take the effort of many people to change it. And so part of that is to practice non-attachment around identity for me, and to not be fooled by these categories. These are, these are illusion. It's all these identity categories are socially constructed, and then we start seeing them as objective realities, and that's a very dangerous illusion. And we see all around us. You have only to just go onto social media for a moment to see how that damages people's capacity to connect to each other and to connect to their true selves, to what there really is of them, what there really is of them beyond a set of identity labels.
Yes, and I really want to hone in on this idea that this is all socially constructed. All of the different categories of identity, that they're abstract. They are something that we as society have built up. And for me, neuroqueer theory, it doesn't necessarily raise the concept of social constructivism, more so the concept of social deconstructivism. It invites us to deconstruct the things that we as a society have built. And that doesn't just apply to neurotypical society, in inverted commas. In the neurodiversity movement, in the neurodiversity activist movement, we have constructed our own normative ideas. We have our own concepts of what is and isn't acceptable, how we should refer to things, how we should embody certain aspects of ourselves. But actually, neuroqueer theory invites us to deconstruct not just the normative attitudes of non-autistic society or non-ADHD society, but it invites us to deconstruct the ideas that even the neurodiversity movement has built up. And
Yes.
I think for me, sort of engaging with neuroqueer theory has shown me that it really highlighted just how different every single person is. And the fact that whilst having these identity categories can be helpful for building a sense of community, it's important to recognize that no one is ever going to 100% relate to our own ideas of what those identity categories mean. They will mean something different to every single person, and that's okay. And the way we approach our neurodivergence, the diversity of human minds, is, as you said, we have to drop these essentialist ideas that there is, these different pipes that everyone fits into, and that's where they stay forever, because everything is changing. But something I've been keen to get your opinion on, so a question I get asked a lot is, because obviously I've been talking about neuroqueer theory a lot since reading Neuroqueer Heresies, and one of the questions that keeps coming up from people that follow my work is, can neuroqueerness be an innate quality, or does there have to be a level of intentionality behind neuroqueerness?
That's a good question. I I would say here, look, I think Remy Yurgo addressed this really well in their book Authoring Autism, because they describe autistic people as neuroqueer, and I think that that's possible. I think uh, anybody can be neuroqueer intentionally. Anyone can neuroqueer intentionally, can engage in the practice and queer neuronormativity, liberate themselves from neuronormativity, subvert neuronormative performance, and be free of the shackles of neurotypicality. Anyone can do that. Anyone can creatively diverge or diverge further, customize their neurocognitive performance and embodiment. But there are people, and autistic people really stand out as an example here. There are people who, for whom performing neurotypicality is just not an option. Just like, again, it works the same because it's entwined with heteronormativity. It works the same there. There are people who can stay in the closet and pass for straight and pass for cis. And then there are people who just can't pass. It's not an option. Like, no matter how much they try, in their teen years, say in high school, to avoid bullying by doing a cis heteronormative performance, somehow the performance is unconvincing. It's so unnatural to them that they know that it's a performance. They know they're queer, and other people recognize it too, and either target them for it, or like, ooh, that person sets off my gaydar, I want to get to know them. And I think the same thing. I mean, you get a non-speaking autistic person whose embodiment is this constant state of stimming. They're not going to pass for neurotypical. And so their embodiments and their very means of communication options, intrinsically queer neuronormativity. And that's, so yeah, in that sense, it can be innate. But anyone, if anyone can do it, though. That's the key point for me. So I don't think a person, well, here's what I'll say is that every time I publish something, I quickly regret it because my views evolve, and particularly because the responses to what I publish cause my views to evolve often. And I think, oh, if I could write it knowing now what I know then, I would do it differently. And you can see in Neuroqueer Heresies, there's these old pieces, and there's my commentary about things I figured out after I published the pieces. And now, if I were to do another edition of Neuroqueer Heresies, there'd be like 100 pages of new commentary on each chapter and on the commentaries in each chapter, based even just on, you know, how people have interpreted or failed to understand things in the book.
Mm.
So in my published writings on neuroqueer so far, I've talked about neuroqueer as an identity label, because what happened was I never meant it to be an identity label. It was a verb first. One neuroqueers, one engages in neuroqueering, and we can see that, in Yurgo talking, for instance, about autistic people, that autistic people queer normativity. We neuroqueer through our embodiment, the fact that we confound normative expectations. We're queering it by being, when we are ourselves, when we give ourselves embodied self-expression as autistically, when we live autistically, we are queering normative expectations and queering neuronormativities. We are neuroqueering by being ourselves. And that was always what I thought about it, queering as a verb. I did not, because I'm averse to identity politics, I wasn't thinking about it as an identity label. And what happened was the term leaked out before I was ready for it to leak out. I had coined it in 2008, and sometime after that, Athena Lynn Michaels Dillon had also come up with the term independently, and Yurgo had not, Remy Yurgo had not coined the term, but had started thinking about autism as a form of neurological queerness, so was sort of moving in that direction. And we all came together in this conversation in a private Facebook group of, autistic scholars and bloggers and writers and such. We kind of came together like talking about it with a bunch of other people, and there were a bunch of other people in the group. Mm. And so some people who were involved in that group, not me and Athena and Remy, but some other people who were involved in the group, immediately grabbed onto the term and were so excited they want to put it out there, and just started putting it out there in their social media and blogs and such right away. And it took me a while before it was another year or so before I wrote my short piece, Neuroqueer, an Introduction, with like the first official attempt to define it. And by that time, it was just spreading like wildfire. And I, Remy and Athena and I, had all planned, Remy was working on authoring autism. We'd all kind of planned to find a way to articulate better what we meant by it, and to develop a coherent neuroqueer theory before putting it out there. And we didn't have that luxury because the word was kind of instantly appropriated and put out there. And what happened, kind of to my horror and revulsion, was that the people who encountered the term and liked it immediately started grabbing it as an identity label. Mm. And just another identity label, and then started policing it, as people do with identity labels, like, you can't be one of us, the way immediately creating this us and them of like, you have to be, you know, born neurodivergent and queer to be neuroqueer, which was exactly opposite what we were getting at with this. And what I did when I started writing about it, and in my published writings about it so far, I took a accommodating approach there, where I was like, as a, you know, if we're going to use this as an identity label, if we're going to use neuroqueer as a label of, as a marker of identity, it's a fluid one. It's completely contrary to the spirit in which neuroqueer is intended to police it and tell other people you're not allowed to identify this way, and to limit it, because the whole point of it is that neuroqueering is something anyone can do. And as I say in my original Neuroqueer and introduction essay, you're neuroqueer if you neuroqueer.
Yeah.
You engage in the practice of neuroqueering, then you can call yourself neuroqueer if you darn well want to. And that is crucial, that it's not an identity label to be owned by some particular group. It's something you are, and if you choose to regard yourself that way, and you know, all it takes is practicing. In a sense, the very act of deciding to call yourself neuroqueer is an act of neuroqueering. So anyone who claims the label legitimately can claim the label. But if I were writing it now, if I could go back in time to like before it got out of the box, before it, you know, before it ran wild, and back to like, you know, 2012 or something, and be the first, you know, be publishing about neuroqueer when no one had heard the term before, and just put out a neuroqueer manifesto to start things off, I would say, don't use it as an identity label. And I mean, I don't police other people's identities. People can use anything as an identity label, but I would say my recommendation, my sense of what is valuable about this term and the lesson it has to teach, like, don't use it as an identity label at all. It's a verb. It's an adjective. You know, we can talk about neuroqueer spaces and neuroqueer practices, but I would at this point much more strongly discourage people from using it as an identity label, because I think that just turns it into more of the identity politics that neuroqueer theory is intended to liberate people from. And I don't want to see people get trapped in that and attached to that identity any more than I want to see people get attached to any other identity. So yeah, that's where I'm at with it now. I don't even remember how I got started on this bit of the conversation, but I hope that addressed something.
It made some really good points, because for me, you know, neuroqueering, neuroqueer theory, and yes, I have used neuroqueer as an identity label at times, but for me, it evolved in my head into that concept I've talked about of the chaotic self, because using that as some kind of identifier, it's a bit of an inside joke with myself, because the chaotic self is anything and everything. Like, it's whatever it means to the person using it, because to me, existence is chaos. Like, it's this ever-changing, growing, never knowing what's coming next sort of thing, and it's just embodying whatever you are in the moment. So anyone who relates to the chaotic self, I don't care how they use that, because it's whatever it means to them. But neuroqueer as an identifier is, the minute you turn it into a label, you've placed expectations on what neuroqueer is, which is fundamentally not neuroqueer. Like, you know, but then the thing I find funny is that the people using neuroqueer as an identifier and policing it, you're then inviting other people to neuroqueer by intentionally subverting your idea of neuroqueer.
Yes,
It
exactly.
becomes this huge cycle of almost like self-defeating logic. And
I
I
love
think
that.
you talked about in your in your book, you talked about the fact that any attempt to define neuroqueerness is going to invite people to subvert that definition.
Right.
And I just find that really freeing, because for me, neuroqueer theory is literally about liberation from normal. Like, you talk about post-normal possibilities as part of the subtitle of your book. And for me, post-normal society has become something that I think we need to push for. I guess it gets wrapped up in that idea of neurocosmopolitanism, no one having privilege over another, because there is no standard of normal. We are just humans. But I guess this leads me on to another point that I wanted to discuss, which is neuroqueering as an act, that authentic embodiment of whatever is true for you, that subverting of expectation. It's not actually accessible to everyone, is it? Because if you are of a particular marginalized group, for example, people of color, queer people, if you authentically embody yourself or subvert the wrong expectations, because of the normative standards of society at the moment, it could put your life in danger. So I guess I wonder, how do we make neuroqueering accessible to everyone?
I don't think we have to. Neuroqueering is accessible to everyone. I think that what you've raised is actually a common misconception about what I'm getting at with neuroqueer theory.
Okay.
I think that people confuse neuroqueering with just unmasking.
Okay.
And it's not the same thing, because otherwise I would have just said unmasking.
Okay.
And with unmasking, there have been some books written recently about unmasking, like autistic unmasking, stop masking, stop putting on a shell of normative embodiment. And the unmasking has exactly the flaws, the discourse on it has exactly the flaws that you've described, that many people are not in a position, because of all sorts of things, their location, the color of their skin, lots of different factors. Many people are in a position where it's not actually safe for them to unmask, where they will be targeted for it. And so I'm not a fan of these books that are like, everybody should completely unmask, because it's not accessible to everyone.
As if it's a choice as well. Like, I don't just go, I'm going to take the mask off today. Like, the mask that people see of me is sort of conditioned into me. It's not something that I chose to put on.
Right. And so you're getting close to my point here. Neuroqueering is different than that, because neuroqueering is about liberating yourself from that conditioned normative performance. And it essentially, and there's a lot of different ways to do it. As I've said, there's no limit to what sort of practices could be neuroqueering practices, depending on the individual and the circumstances. But at no point have I ever said everyone should unmask, because I know that that's not safe for everyone. And, it's not, and in some circumstances, it's not safe for anyone. But what neuroqueering is a different approach, because it is about liberating ourselves in a deep internal way, liberating ourselves from internalized normativity in a way that gives us more options. And that includes the options of putting on any masks we need to put on. What neuroqueering is not, I will pull off the mask, and because again, that could get a lot of people killed. Neuroqueering is, I will explore my true self so that I'm aware that the masks are masks. And then I have more choices about the masks and when I wear them. Because again, we have this like, we live in a racist society right now, there's always, racist cops out there looking to target Black people, Black person, Black person, neuroqueers, if a Black person does like, a Black autistic person does complete unmasking, expresses their full autistic embodiment out in the world, they could get targeted and killed. And that's not something I would ever recommend trying, but neuroqueering is different. Neuroqueering, like a person who is not in a position where they can safely unmask in public, you can unmask in private, you can explore in private, experiment with embodiment, do deep transformative somatic work so that the mask is no longer internalized. And then you can make decisions. Oh, I'm going out now. I'm going somewhere where I might not be safe. I'm going to put the mask on, but I'm not trapped because I know it's a mask. And as soon as I get home or to a safe place, I can drop the mask. And so it's about increased fluidity, not about everybody should unmask whether it's safe for them or not. And that's a crucial distinction.
So to sum up, if I'm gathering this correctly, masking is with regards to your physical embodiment, but neuroqueering is liberation of the self.
Yes, it's liberation of the self, and liberation means having more options. That's crucial. And that's where, like, for instance, I mean, this is like the great fallacy of like Soviet communism, for instance, as someone who, loves Marx's work, but, Karl and Groucho both, as somebody, I love, that, but if you look at what happened with Soviet communism or Chinese communism, after communist revolutions, they're having this revolution for the sake of liberation because people are being forced to live in terrible, degrading, restrictive ways. Their options and choices are being taken away. But after the revolution, their choices are just taken away in a different way. They're constrained to a different set of highly restrictive options. And so it's not an actual liberation hasn't taken place. A revolution has taken place, but not a liberation. And I think that if you go from, I'm going to wear the mask of neurotypicality for my own protection, to I'm completely unmasked and just whatever comes up spontaneously is coming up, and that that's not only dangerous for a lot of people, but it's not liberation either, because the person has gone from I don't have the option of unmasking to I don't have the option of masking, and that's not liberation. Liberation means you have more choices for how to live and for what to do in a given moment. And that's what neuroqueer is about. And so in neuroqueering, you're freeing yourself from the shackles of internalized normativity. You're freeing your embodied capacities so that you have more options. But that means if you're in a position where putting on a mask of neurotypicality is the tactically smart thing to do or the only safe thing to do, it means you can do it and not have to identify with that mask. And then you can take the mask off and put on a different one whenever that's tactically sound and not have to identify with the mask.
Yes, and I guess it brings you to that point of realization that neuroqueering is freedom from ideology, or at least someone
Yes.
else's ideology. And that doesn't just go for cis hetero neuronormative ideology. It's freedom from all ideology, including the neurodiversity movement's ideologies. It's about recognizing that there are things we are not ever going to identify entirely with any particular group's beliefs about what we should or shouldn't be. The only thing that we can ever agree to is our own experience, because that is the only thing we can know to be true. And any attempt by any group, whether they're neurodivergent or perform neurotypically, any attempt by any group to enforce an idea of what is acceptable, what is normal, is going to be fundamentally flawed under neuroqueer theory.
Yes.
And I guess for me, this is what has been so liberating about neuroqueer theory, because it sounds simple on the surface. It's not. It's very complicated for me, and I don't have time to get into it. But for me, it gave me permission to be myself.
Yes.
But the ramifications for that are so deep when you really think about what being yourself means. I mean, I could probably make quite a good career off of writing books every week on what my being myself means.
Right.
There is a lot. I think when you really think about it, the amount of things that go into what your sense of self is innumerable. We are beings of infinite possibility.
Yes, exactly. That's very much, that's core to neuroqueer theory for me. It's core to where I'm coming from with that, is that we are beings of infinite possibility. And there's the being yourself, and the self, of course, is continually fluid. So there's the being yourself, and there's the continually creating and recreating yourself. And as I said, with regards to the whole difference between neuroqueering and unmasking, and again, this is crucial for people who need to survive in situations of oppression, for instance, or who just want to have fun with it. Neuroqueering is also the freedom to not be yourself on your own terms.
Yeah.
So it's the freedom to, it involves this freedom to put on masks if that's what you need to do, and not have to deeply internalize them, and to exchange them. There's kind of a trickster element to it. There's a strong trickster element to neuroqueering. And it's like, okay, I can, there's some authentic self, there's some authentic thing that just emerges spontaneously from me. And then it's like, okay, well, to be safe in this situation, maybe I need to perform normativity a little bit more. And so I can put that on, and the true self is still in there breathing. I don't have to deeply internalize the mask, but I can play it convincingly. And it has a different neurocognitive effect on me in terms of the neurocognitive pathways it builds. Deeply internalizing the rigid armor of the mask does something neurocognitively that I find unpleasant. Wearing the mask convincingly, but knowing that it's a performance, does a very different thing neurocognitively that can be enjoyable. And there's also situations where it is safe. If I find myself in a situation where it is safe, not only do I have the option of unmasking, I have the option of pushing it further into exaggerating the more distinctively autistic aspects of my embodiment. And that's a different kind of mask. Like, there's my authentic autistic self, and there's the masks of normativity I could play with that mask that to varying degrees. And then there's the autistic mask of like, can I lean into autistic expression more than I actually have to because of what that will communicate and what that will do for me in terms of neurocognitive shifts that I might find desirable?
I kind of like to think about identity like it's going to sound weird maybe, but like a wardrobe. There are the clothes that
Yes.
I feel comfortable going out in that authentically represent me, but I am comfortable wearing them in public. There's the ones that I wear in the privacy of my own home that I just like to wear for the fun of it. There's the ones that I wear out in public when I want to make a statement, regardless of whether I feel comfortable in them. It's because I want to surprise people and subvert. Sorry about that. My phone was meant to be on silent. I with the wardrobe analogy, there are all these different combinations that I can try out in whatever environments I feel comfortable to try them out in. And some of them are just purely for me, and some of them are because there is an expectation that I don't want to meet, and I want to make a statement about not meeting that expectation. It kind of brings home the fact that neuroqueering, it's not just about the fact that identity is this infinite fluid concept, but that my expression of that concept is infinite as well. And it's not always, I don't have to express exactly who I am all the time. I can express whoever I want to express.
Yes, absolutely. And for me, part of that departure from identity politics has started to look like, people lead with their identities so much. People lead with their identity labels that they've perhaps over-identified with, and I see that, you look at it in like a person's, social media bio, what's someone's short Twitter bio and such, or when someone's author bio, and my author bio was, when I publish something, and, my social media bios always used to lead with like, these, queer, autistic, transgender, and I'm doing that less and less. Every now and then it's useful, or I have a particular thing to communicate, but more often I'm not leading with identities. I'm not leading with like, hi, these are the categories I belong to. These are the boxes I fit into. I want to see a shift away from that trend, because I think it's like waving a flag or a bunch of flags. There's a something about it that reminds me of nationalism. And I think we can see this when we look at right-wing identity politics. It's really obvious. I'm assuming you probably have very few right-wing viewers and listeners and readers.
I hope I don't have to. Well,
Right.
maybe I hope I've got a lot, because perhaps they'll learn something.
Oh, that's true. That's true. But it's definitely not the crowd we're appealing to here. But if it's very clear when we look at right-wing identity politics, we can see how fucked up it is. Like, white supremacism is the original identity politics. That's like white is this entirely invented category that didn't even exist, a few hundred years ago. It was invented, for purposes of creating divisiveness. It was invented by slaveholders for business purposes, essentially, to to create an us and them and to keep justifying atrocities. And so we can easily see that white supremacism is, a toxic form of identity politics, and see the harm in it, and see how just like dangerous white supremacists are as a result of feeling threatened, that they're constantly feeling threats to their identity. They imagine that they're an oppressed group, and they're, here in the US, they're talking about, having a second civil war. There's like this real, like, it's a problem for them and everyone else. They're stuck in this identifying with this archaic, toxic concept. And for some reason, it's harder for people with, so-called progressive politics to recognize the toxicity of their own identity politics, to recognize that the people who are more on our side of things, in the sense of, maybe more politically left-leaning or progressive, people who are, certainly opposed to white supremacism and colonialism and such, their identity politics is also toxic, is like, in fact, a barrier to solidarity. In a sense, the divisiveness of identity politics is why we don't have a good, effective labor movement these days. So, and I think that people think of identity politics, left-wing or progressive identity politics as something, as being progressive, as being leftist, as being something liberatory, but I don't think it is. I think it's an artifact of neoliberal capitalism, and I think that it helps keep neoliberal capitalism in power by dividing the working classes. And it's just, it's marketable. Identity politics creates markets of people who buy things based on their identity. They're just identifying themselves as markets. And I think that if we're ever gonna like overturn neoliberal capitalism, transcending identity politics is going to be an essential step to that. It's not going to happen without that.
That's a really powerful thought, and it certainly makes me think about my own sort of author bio, because I always lead with I'm an autistic, ADHD and schizophrenic author. And for me, I think those identities have become a bit of a safety net. Well, if I can't work out who I am in a moment, at least I know I'm these three things. But actually, using them as an identity kind of gives this false impression of homogeneity, because people have concepts of what those identities mean, and I guarantee they won't match up with the identity that they form in my mind. And we all have our own concepts of what different identities mean, and when we use these labels as a way of identifying ourselves, it gives the false idea that we have all agreed on what they mean. And I think that's probably where a lot of division, even in left-wing circles, comes from, is we don't all have the same idea about everything. As I mentioned earlier, the only thing we can be sure of is our own subjective realities. We can sort of have some.
And God forbid we should be sure of that.
Yeah.
I hope I never get too sure of my subjective realities.
No, for me personally, especially in spite of wanting to not use an identity label here, as a schizophrenic person, one thing I've come to understand is even my own subjective reality can change at a moment's notice. And one thing that I think is real at one moment might suddenly turn out to not be as real as I thought it was the next moment. So, perhaps, I always thought of neuroqueering as an act of a sort of an act of apostasy from the cult of normality, but maybe it goes further than that. Maybe it's liberation from even our own ideas around identity.
Yes.
So it goes further than escaping society's normative attitudes, and perhaps it's escaping from our own normative attitudes.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Very
So
much well put.
we're sort of coming towards the end of our time now. So I just wanted to end on one final point. What do you envision for the future of neuroqueerness? Or neuroqueering, to be more accurate?
I think that depends on what we put out there with it. I mean, it's a future that's ours to create. Your writing is helping to shape it. My writing, conversations like this as they go public, future books that I hope to write, and other things. We're going to shape this future. Where I would like to see it go is I'd like to see it become a powerful liberatory tool and transformative tool that really does help to queer identity politics and start to break us free of the death grip that identity politics has on social discourse these days. Break people free of identity. I want to see a world of creative, solidarity and creative collaborative solutions among people, and working towards creating better futures. And also just a world of more kindness. And I want to see people liberated from suffering and hate. I think that one of the worst things about identity politics, is its manifestation in call out culture and cancel culture, where once one has internalized an identity and picked a side, there's an ideology attached to that says that a person is required to be offended by certain things. They're required to believe certain things, and they're required to be offended by certain things. And that's the opposite of liberation, when being offended isn't really fun, and it is not joyful, and it's not really constructive or creative. And so internalizing an ideology that says that certain things are objectively offended and one is required to be offended whenever one encounters them. And that, again, that's identity politics across the political spectrum. And somehow we can look at what offends white supremacists and right-wing evangelical Christians and say, yeah, that's, they're, look at them up in arms, and just about, people being people, and trying to police us all of the time. But it's harder to see when our own groups do the same thing. But we definitely do, and people get, there's ridiculous just ideologies about what one is required to believe, always believe a person who has this identity over a person who has this identity, regardless of evidence, regardless of whether you know the people personally. And that's not liberation. That's a restrictive ideology that requires people to believe and feel certain things, rather than allowing the possibility of nuance and ambiguity and grace and compassion. I have a practice I do now, which because I've seen in the era of cancel culture, I've seen people I know be accused of things where I, don't trust the accuser. And I've seen people who have a habit of making accusations of various things as a way of gaining social capital as well. And my my practice now is to suspend judgment, to say, okay, I haven't actually met any of the people involved in this. When you look at like these things, like, and you look at these some of them get very public, like, Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard in court over abuse allegations, both of them accusing the other of abusing and such. And my practice now is to not pass judgment, to say, I actually don't know what happened. I actually don't know whether this is true or false. And so I'm not going to make a judgment. I'm not going to pick a side here, and because I'm not qualified. And the idea that one is not qualified to know a thing for certain, and that it's okay to not know a thing for certain, and okay to not pass a judgment, that is extremely liberatory, and it's absolutely blasphemous in the current political climate.
Yeah. Well, I know for me, I certainly envision neuroqueer theory as a kind of philosophical weapon for the liberation of humanity. I see it being extremely far-reaching, and I certainly hope to explore that more in my own work and more of conversations like these. And I'm certainly excited to see where neuroqueer theory leads us.
Yeah, I want to see it lead more into transformative practice. For me, it's always about the attainment of higher human potentials. And I think that when it gets corrupted and twisted to just be about identity, it just entrenches people further in whatever they've internalized about who they are. And I'm looking for the opposite. I'm looking for liberation from that. I'm looking for, how can we be more than what we've been taught we are, or what we've decided in the past we are? And how can we expand our potentials further and become more flexible about who we can be? And so that, to me, is the future that I see it as, being very much about real practices, about transformative practices, about spiritual practices. And that's a dramatic departure from the ideology of the neurodiversity movement, which is, has traditionally been largely a disability rights movement, but neurodiversity is so much more than that. It's the potential of what we mean, what neurodiversity can mean, because diversity is a source of creative synergy. Creativity and innovation and learning and transcendence of old paradigms come from diversity, from non-hostile encounters between different cultures and different minds. And neuroqueering for me is so much about accessing those possibilities in new creative ways, and really taking the concept, exploring other aspects of the neurodiversity, other aspects of the concept that are much more about the creative rather than just about the political.
Yeah, I like that, because the point I wanted to add is that for me, it's not about who we are, it's about who we could be.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Nick, for coming and talking to me today. It's been a fantastic episode of the podcast. I will shortly upload it to the various other platforms as well that it goes on, but thank you so much. This discussion has been, I think I might have gained more from it than the people who have been watching, because it's certainly going to inform my writing moving forwards, because it's helped me sort of hash out some of the ideas that have been bouncing around my head as well. So
Beautiful.
thank you so much, and
Thank you, David.
I will catch everyone in the next episode. So take care, everyone. Goodbye.